I usually describe it to people as if John Steinbeck wrote Superman.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Men of Steel podcast. I'm Case Aiken, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Jmike Folson.
Welcome back, everybody. So glad to have you here.
Yeah, I'm glad that we can gather today because we're talking about a subject that I have wanted to do since we started the show. Today we're talking about the novel It's Superman. And to do that, we are joined by Ryan Haupt.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Ryan, thank you for coming on. You actually suggested this after I reached out to you, since you're familiar with podcasting about comics. You've been a regular guest on the iFanboy show.
That is true. Yeah, you invited me to be on the show. I was very flattered and excited to do it. And then I started scrolling through your back catalog episodes, and I, from even the very, very first earliest episodes, I was like, well, damn it, they've done that. Oh, damn it, they've done that. And I just kept hitting things that I would have loved to have talked about. You've even done the science of Superman, and so that kind of, not stepping on my toes, is your show, but I could have nailed that one. And so
that one is due for a revision at some point. That's us just looking at the documentary that we made.
Right. I listened to it. You guys did a very good job. But the couple of things that were kicking around in my head were like the Max Fleischer era serial cartoons, and then this novel, which is kind of set in that same era, that I'd read years ago. And there's an iFanboy mini back when they used to do the video show where Connor talks about this novel, and it was a copy that I sent him. So I actually had to buy a new copy for this show because he never gave me the book back, which I think I said it as a gift. So I'm not like trying to call out Kilpatrick over here or anything, but I did have to get a fresh copy just to record this episode with y'all.
I'll get you, Kilpatrick.
I feel, and based on the way this book is written, I can throw in some like Scots-Irish racial slurs. And
yeah. I have a note in the outline that we definitely need to talk about the treatment of race in this, which I think is actually kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we'll get there. But yeah, so this is a 2005 novel by Tom DeHaven. It's basically the story leading up to Action Comics #1. Like the last chapter or so, there's a couple of events alluded to that are things that happen in the first couple issues of Superman. It's not super hardcore, like this is the exact cutoff point kind of thing, but it's basically doing here's the story leading up. Yeah, so I had read this initially around 2010, 2012, somewhere in that. It's been about a decade. Jmike, had you read this before?
No. No, I had not. This is my first time even hearing about this book when you guys suggested it. And I was like, okay, cool. And I read the reviews, and I think somebody called it Superman Noir. And I was like, that's interesting.
I usually describe it to people as if John Steinbeck wrote Superman.
Well, I had the audiobook, and that was 16 hours of someone talking just like this with voices just like this. And he stopped down and his eyes were gunky again. But I was like, oh, I see how this is going to go. We're going to get this going. This is going to be a whole treat.
So I listened to the audio version for this episode. And what was throwing me listening to it was that it was Scott Brick was the narrator, who also was the narrator for Larry Tye's book on the history of Superman. And in that, he's like, it's a very like, here's the story of Superman, like, and the story of like how the comic came to be, and then how like each iteration was sort of developed and so forth. It's very like broad perspective. And in this, it's then not. It's a third person narrator. It's he's actually trying to put on characters and so forth. And it was just an interesting vibe because it was the same person talking about the same subject but from a different lens. And I found that kind of interesting. Purely from a like, oh well, this is the voice actor that they're using kind of standpoint.
Yeah.
Like not much. I rather enjoyed the audio version once I kind of got into the rhythm with it. Like the first couple chapters, there's a lot more jumping around.
Yeah.
You don't really establish the voices for the characters yet. You're kind of still just trying to figure out what's going on. by the time by the time he's doing all like the parts, including like Soda Waters and like Mrs. O'Shea and all that, you're like, all right, you're having fun. Like have fun with those parts. Yeah, but it's not like one of those the more produced ones like American Gods, where there's like multiple voice actors. And
I didn't check out the audiobook. I'm not really an audiobook guy. I especially since I knew we were going to be discussing this, I knew that I had to do an actual reread just because I would get distracted with an audiobook and I probably wouldn't remember or take away as much. So I actually sat down and read it again.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like I really enjoyed this at the time, and I really enjoyed the revisit. It's funny, like I think the first time I read it, I was just sort of like enthusiastic about the nature of like, all right, so we're going to set a story in like Dust Bowl, Kansas, and like talk about that character as if he was actually going to make his debut as Superman in 1938. I thought like just that premise by itself was so compelling, and then I think that we end up with a book that it's a deconstruction. It's talking about like the inner monologues of all these characters in this completely weird world where eventually Superman fights a robot.
Well, it's like if you've read Action Comics #1, they don't really go very far in terms of introducing the character. Like I know you guys on the show have talked about the evolution of his powers and all that. You know, a lot of the more narrative versions of his powers and backstory didn't come until they had the radio serial and then the Max Fleischer cartoons, and that's where we get that whole, you know, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive. But in Action Comics 1, they're kind of like, yeah, he's a strong dude. He's from Kansas. He's raised in an orphanage. Like now he, you know, fights crime. And he's kind of just the squinty-eyed, square-jawed, all-American man. And so I really liked that the premise of this book was like, well, let's, instead of, you know, doing the Golden Age comic thing where we devote barely a page to who this character is and what he's about before getting into the story, let's do the exact opposite and spend just a ton of time delving into who this guy is as a character and worry less about, like, what does he actually do with these abilities. I just thought that was a cool twist on the original premise.
Yeah, I think this articulates really well the thing I find so interesting about Superman stories, where he's so powerful, but that power by itself is a burden. You know, the first scene that we're really dealing with Clark, the movie theater scene, I think is such an interesting exploration of a character dealing with the impossible. And he's the one who just did it. Like, he just got shot and it didn't hurt. And in fact, the other guy died because it bounced off him and ricocheted into the person. And
that's another, that ties in so many different things that I think even when I first read this book, after the first chapter, I was like, oh, I'm in, I'm going to like this. Just because I love the setting. I love setting it back in the 1920s and 30s, just because when you try to make Superman ship only have crashed, you know, within 30 years of his debut as Superman, or maybe a little even shorter than that, you run up to so many weird, like, things. It's the same thing that happens with, like, how did Nick Fury fight in World War II? How did Frank Castle fight in Vietnam? And it's, you know, wouldn't they be old men now? And so, like, if you try to say that Superman's ship crashed in the 80s, then Mark Waid goes and creates this whole backstory where Martha Kent's, like, super into UFOs and UFO culture. And I'm like, well, that's weird. And I don't like that. That was from Birthright, if people don't remember. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that didn't work for me. And so for me, it just works better to, like, let's put this at a time before we even were really thinking about aliens and space people from the sky, and just have it be a complete mystery to Clark and his family what really happened that wound up with them having this baby on their doorstep. And I thought that was really cool. And then with the scene at the movie theater, I loved that. I loved when he goes to the sheriff's office and he notices that the sheriff does something left-handed, and he's like, oh, that's great because I'm left-handed. And he's constantly looking for little things that he has in common with humanity, because I think he knows deep down there's something is deeply uncommon about him. And I just thought that was such a good read of the character and how desperate he would be to belong and to fit in with this human race that he finds himself among. And I was like, okay, that's good insight to this character. I think we're gonna have a fun time with this book.
Yeah, it's a real strong hook into a character who oftentimes comes off as kind of opaque. You know, like oftentimes the viewpoint character is like the Jimmy Olsen or someone to perceive Superman by, rather than really getting into his head. And even when they try to, it still feels like, well, how much are you going to relate to this perfect person who is, like, morally right in every moment and so powerful? And here I think we do a really good job of that. Like, I think that you really illustrate, like, just how terrifying and strange everything is for this person. And only at the start of the novel is he even coming to sort of appreciate some of those things, like him having these, like, physical abilities. They talk about how he always felt uncomfortable about it. Now finally he's sort of enjoying the idea of running home so fast and like all these like impossible things are just now starting to be a source of wonder and not fear.
Well, because it's clear at the start of the novel that he is a person who has not his lack of natural curiosity about himself and his abilities means that he has not really explored what he can do and come anywhere near the limits of his abilities. And that also fits what nicely with, Golden Age Superman, who was a lot less powerful than Silver Age or modern Superman. And I just liked that, he needed other people to push him, because as far as he knew, he was just like, well, I never really get sick. I'm not really ever hot or cold. Never had a cut, scrape, or bruise. I'm just really tough. And that's kind of all he knew about himself. And then it took him a long time to figure out that it went beyond just being tough. And it actually was super, not just exceptional.
Yeah. And him not being curious about his powers isn't that weird. I mean, like, I don't know how curious I'm about my own athleticism. Like, he had his interests, like he had his concerns. He, worked the farm dutifully for his parents. Like, he cares so much about Ma Kent, and it's just like a gut-wrenching, like, slow death of her at the beginning of the book that is like completely occupying his thoughts. They establish that he's into science fiction, that he has like all these interests, but they're not related to his powers like that. So like, why he's like a nerd. Which I think we can all relate with.
I mean, maybe.
I think if I suspected that I had anything approaching Clark's levels of abilities, I would be testing the limits of it pretty much continuously. Maybe that's the scientist in me just wanting to,
You pull the Shazam, or he's like out in the middle of the junkyard, like doing stuff.
Yeah. If I'd never had a cut, scrape, or bruise, I think I'd be pretty fearless about trying just getting up to some wacky stuff.
But I wonder sometimes with the depiction of those kind of sort of powers and explorations of that, where if you ease into it, would you have the same realization that it's as weird as it is? Like with a Shazam scenario, like in the movie, or just like superpowers generally, where it's like, oh, lab accident, spider bite, whatever. Like there's a very dramatic shift. And if when he was younger, like maybe he did stub his toe, but it healed really fast and it never really was an issue, or like, very, very minor stuff on this like fledgling super being, where the concept of pain wouldn't be completely out there. Like he still gets hurt later on. And I mean, sure, like they kind of, it's the typical thing of like, oh yeah, the needle really didn't work for any sort of like injections or anything like that. Like all the classic Superman stuff is still there, but like he's like, would he even realize that it's that different than just like a baby learning to walk in the first place?
I mean,
I know.
I think Clark grew up on a corn farm, right? But my family comes on my mom's side comes from like wheat farmers, and like farms are dangerous places. Like I feel like it would be obvious that like the fact that Clark has all 10 fingers and 10 toes and both eyes and has never broken a bone, like while working an active farm, is a miracle. Like I don't know farmers who don't get really badly injured in the line of duty, so to speak. So maybe that's just I believe that Clark is actively sort of ignoring or suppressing his own curiosity about how strange he truly is. And maybe it's just because he and his dad and his parents don't talk about it as much as they do in some of the other versions of the character, but
they're not good on sharing.
No. Well, I guess so. Because later on the dad talks to Clark a little bit more about stuff, but yeah, I guess they would be considered really bad at sharing their emotions and stuff.
Particularly Pa with Clark, like those two, it's a big hurdle for them to actually like open up with each other.
I don't know if we've ever seen another Superman story, at least not one that I've read recently, where like we learn about Pa's feelings about his own dad, and whether that's canon or not. I thought it was a good way to represent that character's hesitation about like he actually was kind of relieved every month when Martha wasn't pregnant, and he was really scared of being a father. And I like that every person in this story, and a lot of times in the comics they're presented as kind of these on a pedestal, holier than thou, never told a lie, never done a wrong thing characters. I like that they're shown as like more flawed and vulnerable and scared people in this story than we get in a lot of the other comics. And I tend to think of this story as like just another Elseworlds. It's weird that it's not in comic book format. I think it works as a novel. I think having it as a novel gives it a lot of room to breathe. But to me, this is like and I think one of the criticisms people level of this book is that it's not a valid interpretation of Superman. But to me, it's like No, this is just a different version of the character. This is no different than Red Sun, than the Nail, than any of those other awesome Elseworlds that exist out there.
Mm-hmm. Like, I think it is really interesting that we do have so much runway with all these characters. You know, I think, like you said, Jonathan particularly, like the amount of insight we get into him is so unique. You know, usually we talk about like
Martha.
Look. Well, not just Martha, but like look at the Kents. Look, like this wonderful family that raised the super child. Could you imagine if he was raised by anyone else? He may not have been such a good boy.
These all loving, all knowing, all wise, elderly mother and father who raised his kid, this alien kid.
And I do think that the Kents that we get here are still that good, but they have doubts and like they have issues that they have to work through. You know, like Martha, we don't get that much with, you know, aside from the amount of love that both Jonathan and Clark have for her in this one. I mean, we get a little bit, but you know. But
there's the cool thing about the way Martha is portrayed in this story, which is true for a lot of the other characters too, is that, you know, one thing DC can't, as a giant media company. I remember there was a thing a couple of years back where there was a cover that Gary Frank drew that had Paul and Clark, you know, leaning up against the fence post drinking a beer, and they had to edit it to be a root beer because they can't have Superman drinking beer, even though it wouldn't affect him. He would be fine, and they're both adult. They're like allowed to have beer. Like it just so the things that the hoops that DC jumps through to prevent offending even the smallest percentage of people who are reading their comics means that we'll never know like how religious Ma Kent is in the comics. Like they'll just keep it as vague as possible because they don't want to upset anybody. And here you have a relationship where Ma's a person of deep faith and it's really important to her and she talks about it openly. And Jonathan is a guy who has more doubts than not. And they kind of both give their perspective to Clark. And like you would never get that level of character introspection that actually, you know, hints at the fact that Clark Kent might be an atheist. Like, oh my God, you know, and I thought that was so cool that he actually got to explore all these facets of the character that the comics are never going to be able to touch.
Holy crap, I never thought about that. You're saying this, I'm like, oh my gosh, I never realized that. Because like it's certain things that you kind of take for granted that you never really think about, like, oh, whatever, his parents were this, and this, but we get Superman out of that. You never think about, oh, you know, you never really hear them talk about religion.
I think that's because they just want people to assume. Like they want the idea, I think, is like if we are vague about it and don't ever say, then people will just assume that
project their own stuff onto it.
Exactly, you know.
Yeah, I mean the most we've seen the most that we've like really looked at was like in For All Seasons, where he goes to his reverend for advice at several points, and like there is a religious fixture of Smallville, the community there, but even there we don't get that much specifically on how Clark or the Kents themselves feel about it, aside from just being like they love everyone in their town.
And you know, you grow up in a small town, like whether you're religious or not, the church is a hub for that community, and so the person leading that church is likely to be a source of, you know, guidance and counsel in moments of stress and doubt. It's not like Clark has access to a therapist. I wouldn't even know if schools had guidance counselors back then. So you know, stuff like that doesn't bother me. It's just interesting that like this novel, because Tom DeHaven basically said, I'm only writing this if I get carte blanche to do whatever I want, like almost to the point of no notes, that he was able to play around with some stuff that the comics can't usually get into. Because there's that whole thing a couple of years ago that like Superman was going to vote in the presidential election, but they ended up being like super lame and coy about like, but did he vote Democrat or Republican? I'm just like, that's stupid. This is a dumb story.
Yeah. I remember when they did the Death and Return of Superman, in one so Cyborg Superman saves Bill Clinton's life, and there's like then an extended scene where there is a bar fight of people debating whether or not Superman was a Democrat or Republican, and all just in the background right there. and they're just not allowed to really do that. Like he has to be a kind of centrist figure for everyone, being like, yeah, no, he's a good guy, right? Like, and not have to like have a stance as hard in that regard.
Now, Batman on the other hand, no, I'm just kidding. And what's crazy is that like towards the end of the book, I'd forgotten about this. There's a scene that heavily implies that there is an afterlife, even though both Superman and Lex at different points say that they don't think there is. And then this just totally human character gets like this, you know, could just be a coma dream or whatever, but it's like heavily implied that like, oh, he was on the other side for a minute and then came back.
Yeah.
Which I thought was an interesting little twist to throw into, you know, everyone's talk of their conception of the universe and God and the afterlife and all that stuff.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, Lex Luthor is actually not that far from Superman relative to the other people here. Like,
well, and there's that. I mean, I thought about that a lot in terms of the original idea for Superman. Like the Siegel and Schuster version was more like a Lex Luthor, like he was kind of an alien evil genius, not a big friendly strongman. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the reign of the Superman, where he was bald and had psychic powers, and if only he had done good a little bit faster, because by the end of it, his powers have faded.
Yeah, so that to me, that version, like clearly, I know there's other characters that version of Superman has kind of bled into a little bit, like Ultra Humanite, but I always think about that the fact that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's earliest ideas of a Superman ended up being more of their Lex Luthor character than their actual hero character.
Yeah, I mean they certainly act as like the big gravitational forces that like we're just waiting for them to interact, and everyone else kind of orbits around. Like the reason why Clark really gets on this path is because he meets Willie. Willie is on this path because of Lex Luthor directly. Like that you can feel how their existence is going to matter so much when they come together, and that like everyone they interact with is kind of pushing the two of them to get there, if that makes any sense.
A little. I mean, I think the biggest departure that this story takes from the Superman stories we've known from before is that Clark doesn't go from Smallville to Metropolis. Like in
Right.
almost every other Superman story I can think of, there's not really any stops in between. I think in Birthright, he spends some time as like a student bumming around in like different parts of the world. But
Man of Steel, like the John Byrne Man of Steel, he like wanders around and he eventually settles in Metropolis, they say. So,
but but like in stories like Smallville, like Metropolis is literally the skyline you can see from the water tower, and like it's always
Right.
It's always been this sort of I've got to get from out of my small town into the big city, and that's like something he really wants. It's a goal he pushes towards in his adolescence, and here it's like he's so conflicted about whether or not he even wants to leave Smallville ever. And then when he finally does, he ends up basically becoming a train bum with his buddy Willie, and they end up in Hollywood, and he ends up making pictures. And I just was like, wow, this is such like a wild swing for how he ends up eventually in. And there is no Metropolis in this story; it's just New York City, which I think that might be the one part of the book that doesn't totally work for me. I really missed having the City of Tomorrow and they make a lot of references to New York City being Metropolis. They mentioned the movie, they have an art exhibit and all this other stuff. But yeah, the idea of him doing stunt work, throwing himself off of horses and down the desert cliffs in California, I thought was the part of this book that I expected the least, and I was surprised I didn't hate it.
yeah, part of it is I very much enjoyed Diane Dewey.
Yes.
As just sort of like a different love interest for the character. Like, it's fun that's alliterative, but a different alliteration from what all the other things that Superman gets. The double L's. In this
It's
case,
also like the double L's could be like left, and then the double D's could be like dexterous for right, like left and right, and on two different coasts. I just thought of that.
That's that is a wild take right there. I would not have thought about that.
It probably means nothing, but it just came to my head.
But I do like her as a character. Like it felt nice to explore that phase of Clark's life. That's like right out of not college, but like that age range, that like 21-year-old kind of phase. Trying to figure out who he is and like make the most of his talents for the first time, in not a really selfish way. I mean, like he's still like he's taking the hits for people who may not have survived those stunts, which I think is still like kind of an interesting vibe. I mean, it made me think of Simon Williams' Wonder Man as like an aspiring actor type character, but like less spotlight focused. Like like that character is usually more of a glory hound type, or at least is presented that way, like in shorthand. And here it's like, oh no, we get to sort of like look back on like golden age Hollywood pictures, like the studio system and whatnot that people oftentimes have like a fair amount of nostalgia for, and kind of explore that scenario, explore like him being a stuntman, which is like a fun idea because he's not going to get hurt, and it gives a way for him to get to the costume without it having to be like his blanket or his mom, because like it's his mom dying was like part of his original origin. Like Ma dies first, then Pa, and then this actually gives us some time with that and like some a chance to really like feel that all out before we get to the actual character, and that timeline would not allow for Ma Kent to create the Superman costume.
Right. And in this version of the story, they don't say that they found him wrapped in anything. They never seem to recover the ship that he crashed in. This is a time that would have predated radar and sonar and ground penetrating radar. So like, it's not like the government swooped in and took it back. Like, as far as we know, the ship is just lost. It broke up on its entry into our atmosphere, and they have a scrap of it that they can tell is a weird alloy. They don't know what it is, but he doesn't have a lot of evidence about where he comes from. So like, the idea of the S being the Kryptonian symbol for hope and all this other stuff, like there's no basis for that in this version of the story. You have to just come up with a different way to dress him up like a circus strongman.
Yeah, I love the like tongue-in-cheek bit there where it's just like, well, why would a saucer man from Saturn have an S? Like, do they speak English there?
Because Clark is a science fiction nerd.
I appreciate that, because it was a good chance to like comment on a bunch of the elements of the Superman costume that feel like, well, why would they do those things? And I thought it all kind of worked well. And I like the idea of Clark, like, as he's like kind of coming into this idea of the pageantry of being Superman, like gets fascinated by the outfit, you know, like Diane like makes these costumes for Hollywood productions, and he's like just trying it on, being like, it fits pretty well.
Well, because he's also like, he's a farm kid. Like, he's never, you know, he doesn't dress up a lot. Like, he just wears working man clothes and works. And, you know, in that sense, I think the closest we've ever gotten to this version of the character in the comics is when Grant Morrison did his Jeans and Boots reboot of Superman. So like, if you've read those comics and you thought that was I thought that was a really cool direction for the character that I don't think they went far enough with in the comics. I think they you know, gave him a suit of Kryptonian armor way too soon and just kind of went back to the same old. So like, if you liked that version of Superman but didn't feel like you got enough of it, I think this is an awesome book for folks to check out for that.
Why don't we talk about Lois Lane for a second here? Because I really like the character. I like the character always. Like, Lois Lane is like one of my favorite parts of the Superman mythos. Mm-hmm. Especially when they get away from being too damsel in distressy, which I think is a lot of people's read, you know, from 50,000 Miles, but like not when you actually really get into the character. I like that we're introduced to her as like an up and coming journalism student.
Yeah.
I like that she immediately like moves out of what the arrangements her dad set her up with so that she could like smoke and drink and have a boyfriend. And
you know, you're not drinking, are you? No.
She looks at her cocktail
smoking,
shaker.
Are you? Of course not. You're not messing with any boys, are you? Never.
And the way she's described, at least physically, like, to me, in my head, all of the characters look like the versions in the Max Fleischer cartoon.
Yeah.
So, you know, I like the way they describe her. You know, she's clearly very attractive. Everyone's constantly checking her out in the book.
Even her teachers.
Yeah, well, that guy was kind of a creep. But I liked that she was clearly smart. She was hungry. She was, you know, again, this book, because you're able to have this omniscient narrator, you can dig into what's happening in these people's heads in ways that you don't always get in the comics or in the animated or the movies or anything. So, because novels just present different opportunities. And so you get some of her frailties, you get some of her failings, and she's not a perfect person, but she's a person that Clark is really infatuated with, because, you know, there's that idea that she just like represents something about this plucky little species that he finds himself amongst that he just can't help but fall for. And so I thought their dynamic was really good. I like that at the end of the book she comes around a little bit and realizes that she needs to be a little nicer. But overall, I agree. I thought this was a really fun version of the character. And, you know, in the Max Fleischer series, like, Lois is only ever the damsel in distress because she throws herself in situations to get the story, presumably, and then ends up in trouble because she's trying to get the story of like a supervillain trying to set off a volcano in Metropolis. And so, like, how does that not end poorly unless you have Superman's powers?
She throws herself into the volcano.
So yeah, I agree. This was good Lois.
I mean, it's fun having sort of a chance to define like what she would be like in this era, because, you know, as the mythology of Superman has built up, you know, we've added her being like the daughter of an army general, and she's like badass and like, you know, tough, strong woman of today. But looking back and at like the vantage point of what is the 1938 Lois like? Well, she still stands up for herself at every point. She's, you know, maybe a little bit of like a wild child when she's in school still, but like, you know, she still has enough of a moral compass in general. Like she helps out people who are in need. She does not take the easy route of taking advantage of the fact that her teachers are trying to sleep with her. She sticks to her guns. And like, while she might have a bit of a temper, and that, you know, leads to why she gets into such a fight with Clark at the end of the book anyway, because she thinks that Clark took, you know, took the Superman scoop from her, which is a nice rebuttal of that, like that John Byrne scenario of like Superman like giving her the interview and then writing up the same article and like like beating her to the jump. Like I like that we actually got to kind of deal with that element of why that wouldn't have been cool of Superman, because like I always found that bit like kind of annoying.
Yeah, I like that she's already a little bit established as a reporter. She already has a job at the Planet. She actually went to journalism school, whereas Clark only ever wrote for the local paper in Smallville. And I like that, when she goes to these press conferences or these meetings or whatever, Lex stands up at the podium and says, "Hello, gentlemen," and Lois, and like the mayor knows who she is, but they've never like actually had a conversation, but everyone's kind of annoyed that like this girl is doing this man's job of writing things down that happened, like how dare she, but
and asking harder questions than anyone else there.
Right. And I like that she just absolutely water off a duck's back. She does not care that she's ruffling feathers. She just plows ahead and gets the story and works really hard. Like you see how hard she works as a reporter in this, which is cool, because I think a lot of times in the comics and the movies, they just gloss over the reporting thing. Like it's just a thing that they like sit down and write a story, and you very rarely get the story of them tracking down leads and taking notes out in the field. And I love the scene where she has to call into because there was no like email, there was no text, so she calls into the Planet and starts like dictating her story to somebody to type up on the phone, and telling them where to put the M dashes and the capitalized letters and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And it's like, it also feels, I'm not an expert on this period of American history, but it also felt like, this is maybe a larger point, it felt like the way Tom DeHaven writes about this sort of late in the Depression era of America, both in Kansas and in New York and in California, like it felt authentic to me.
Yeah, that I think is one of the strong suits of the book as a whole. Like it feels so real. Like the cultural references feel really accurate.
The way people talk.
Yeah. I mean, like the things people are obsessed with, the divisive figure that is FDR, like all the references to like where people, like New York. I lived in New York for 8 years, so like there's like all these spots where they're talking about locations of things. Now I'm wondering if maybe I read this before I actually moved there, because like there's several spots where I'm like, I was literally at that block a week ago when I was visiting a friend.
If you say that the city is really more of a character, I'm hanging up the call. I will.
I mean, it's not so, but it is nice to at least like have those tangible points,
right? Which you don't get in Metropolis, because everything's on, it's at the intersection of Schuster Lane and Siegel Avenue,
right?
Yeah.
No, in this case, they actually have to be, and I think given one of the sort of elements of the larger piece, like this, the fact that Superman was introduced between world wars, and like there is the conversation in this all about the looming Second World War that everyone knows is coming, like having tangible things, like having real locations to reference and elements that are no longer there, like 5 points, for example, like the fact that you can have a reality that is so close to ours allows for some of those things to have weight that it wouldn't if it was just Metropolis.
Yeah, and it's cool. I mean, it happening between the First and Second World Wars is also interesting because the original Superman character, which I'm sure you've talked about on the show, was not really an establishment person. Like he was kind of he went at it with the cops. He went at it with a lot of his early villains were war profiteers and tenement lords who weren't taking care of their tenants, and guys who beat their wives, which they reference in this. They reference it also in this book. Like one of his earliest stories, he's flying to the governor's mansion to prevent a woman from being executed who was falsely accused. So he was very much like a SJW, social justice warrior. So apologies for taking Superman out of the safe space, but that's where we're at. And it was really World War II that kind of brought him around to being the big blue Boy Scout, to being the guy who was super pro establishment, who, buy your war bonds and stamps, let's support the boys in blue overseas. So it was like really, World War II was kind of a pivotal changing point for the character itself. And so to get that sort of pre-World War II version of the character, and a character who's self-aware enough to know that like, probably not a good idea for me to go over there. It doesn't seem like that's the best use of my abilities. And I like that he had that sort of self-awareness. At least it was hinted at. So, would this book ever get a sequel? And that's something I would love to talk about with you both, maybe closer to wrapping things up. I don't expect that this sequel would be him in Japan or in Europe, fighting in World War II. Although there is a Fleischer cartoon where he goes to Japan and it's super racist. But actually, the Max Fleischer cartoons have a few really, really racist episodes, but the animation is beautiful.
Why don't we pivot into that one? I realize I have an outline that we have not followed at all, but we should talk about the specter of race that pervades this book, because it's set in the mid-30s, and it is I think it's one of the best parts about the characterization of Jonathan, that he does not care about race, but it's very explicit that is not the norm.
Well, and Jonathan and Lex are the only two people,
right? Yeah.
Who
I was shocked.
like Clark has inherited from Jonathan also sort of but
Clark has a naivete about it that is challenged a lot through the course of the book, which I think is like Jonathan and Lex are static. Like they don't have there's no arc about their characters when it comes to race, whereas like race is something that Clark thinks about and is learning a lot about, and there are parallels to him obviously being also an outsider in his community.
Yeah.
But one who can pass. And I think, that's a really interesting juxtaposition to think about.
Yeah, I think with Clark, he's observing how people do other people. Like that is a consistent thing that he keeps stumbling across and rejecting it, but also being scared by it. Like Clark's ability to, as you say, he can pass. And so he does not want to expose himself too much because he's terrified of being rejected for those same kind of things. And
I also think, I think this book is commenting on race consciously. Like it's literally, the first scene in the book is a racially charged
it's super on purpose
moment that happens.
Yeah.
And they talk about the American Nazi Party, and they talk about the Ku Klux Klan, and the first radio serial that Superman was in was Superman Smashes the Klan. And I actually think Gene Luen Yang's comic book adaptation of that is another version of this character that's very similar to the version we get in this book. Superman who's still young and learning his powers and not so sure of himself. But I think a part of this book I'd forgotten about in between my reading it the first time in this reread was some of the stuff he witnesses on the rails when he and Willie end up in that town where there's a lynch mob. And I was like, man, that's dark. Like,
it was real dark.
It was very dark. I was not expecting that in this book. Mainly because you never really get that.
Well,
there's not a lot of Superman stories where he finds a dead body in a safe and then gets tortured by the town folks.
When we talked about the Death of Superboy arc that they did in the 80s following Crisis, there's a lot of like, oh, look how Pleasantville, this alternate reality version of Smallville, is right there. And, I made the joke, like, is Smallville a sundown town? And, it was kind of a thing of like, well, in this scenario, they're not exploring it. They're not investigating it, even though it was interesting that the non-white members of the Legion of Superheroes didn't didn't go into town. And I don't know if that was being consciously avoided or if it just was a happy accident. But like, this is a book where it's like, no, it's rural Kansas. Like they're traveling around and dealing with a lot of that. And that's still the case when they get to Metropolis or to New York. Like, there's a lot of there's a lot of anti-Semitic sentiment that happens throughout. It's a big driver for Willie actually as a character.
And if Superman's anything, he's Jewish. So
right, well, yeah. And then even characters who we kind of like Seal Stokowski is very racist against the Irish, And against she makes at one point, she's like trying not to be racist, but she's like, will there be colored girls? And it's like, that's, it's interesting then that like at several points, like Lex Luthor is the more evolved man in those scenarios. Like the fact that he really does not like the concept of racism.
It's also, but like, I think it's just because I think my read on that is because Lex Luthor is a misanthrope. He doesn't like anybody. Like he thinks everybody's below him, no matter what the color of your skin is, like he just doesn't respect any other person but himself until he meets Clark. And another way that I think there's an intersectionality with the way this book deals with race is the fact that they set it in Dust Bowl era Kansas means that like the Kents are poor. Like they don't have much. Like they're not. Yeah. And they have land, but not as much land as they could. Like Jonathan inherited a bunch of, what the bit he has from Martha's family, which I thought was a really interesting bit of backstory. And the thing I like about that is I remember when when the Smallville was first coming out, the Tom Welling show, and I remember looking at the set that was supposed to be the Kent farmhouse, and I was like, this is a really nice house. Like they live in an upscale, like large
farmhouse.
Yeah, and then so to like juxtapose that with the way that the farmhouse is written about in this book, where it's like Pa Kent didn't spring for electricity because he didn't think he would need it. And even by the end of the book, it's not even in all the rooms in the farmhouse. So I just thought there were some really cool touches with the way like they were poor, but then they also like were dealing with even poorer Black folks. And they mentioned the Mexican community doing the farming when he's in California, and then there's everything with the Jewish community and the Polish community and the Irish community when they're in New York City. And yeah, I thought it was but most of the time in this book, Clark barely has two nickels to rub together, which is, I think, also part of what plays into his sympathies, and then just sort of him connecting with people who are treated as outsiders and are treated as different, because even though he isn't, he feels like he should be. And it's almost like this self-flagellatory thing that he does.
Yeah. And I mean, like, you know, some of that obviously is coming from Jonathan. Like, one of the big sticking points for Jonathan in the community of Smallville was that, you know, like what was the deal? That the church was built by like the Native American community that was living nearby, and like then they weren't actually allowed to go inside. Wasn't that the?
You're right. There was something about that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but
yeah, like, and that's why he rejected like going to that church, because he was like, wait, you're gonna hire these people to build it, but then you're not going to allow them in. And then, like, that continues to be a big thing for Jonathan, like the fact that he accepts Alger first into his home and then Alger's family into his home, which I think is such a nice like through line, because like Alger we're introduced to right at the top of the book, and the fact that he continues to become like a closer and closer member of the Kent family, like that's a reason why people don't go to Jonathan's funeral at the end, because he invited colored people into his house.
Yeah,
and that's very clearly being stated as bad. Like when I say that they talk about race in this, I mean, like, they talk about race to like point out that racism is bad. Just for the record, if anyone's listening being like, what the fuck?
What are they talking about?
Yeah, I agree with that take.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about Luther a bit? Because
real quick though, it's interesting that we never exactly find out what Soda's race is.
Soda, I was thinking about that. I doubled back a couple of times to be like, wait, was there a reference? And I
mentioned it being an old pool hall, an old colored folk pool hall, which, you know, were huge back in the day. I live in DC. We still have them here in DC. It's awesome. And apparently Martin Luther King Jr. was a pool shark, for people who didn't know. And he used to like get young men to come to rallies by being like, hey, if I beat you at pool, you got to come to this rally tomorrow. And then he would just whoop them. And it was, fantastic. But yeah, I thought that character didn't do much I didn't even remember that character, and didn't do much for me this time. I thought that the relationships that she had were not the most interesting part of the story, but I did notice that, like, they say that she took over this club that used to be a pool hall, but they never say what race she herself is, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, and they compare her to black singers,
right?
But
they do.
They never are like
come out and
solidify that. And I was thinking about that when we get to the end of the book, or not the end, but
I guess the only evidence we have is that she, while intoxicated, interacts with several cops and isn't beaten or killed. And so,
well, but they also ignore her.
True.
Yeah,
and you know, like she's they paint her as an older woman, and when they say like she's 37, I was like, oh man, that's just
you did me dirty, Tom DeHaven.
But I get at the time, like, you know, if you're going to be sexist.
You said you want to talk about Lex. I distracted us.
No, it's cool. But yeah, I had the same thought about Soda, that it's weird that she doesn't, and I wonder if the fact that no one is paying attention to her is indicative of the fact that she's supposed to be a minority. But Lex wouldn't care either way. As we pointed out, he's kind of just a misanthrope. I'm going to be honest, like, this book got me interested in some of New York history because I had no idea what an alderman was when I first read this book. And I was like, what is that? And I had to like look it up.
Well, tell us. I don't know.
It's basically like a council of like, it's supposed to be like elders as a general concept. But now it's a big part of the Gilded Age, which is why I sort of like was like, oh yeah, I first learned that term from this book.
Alder, any genus of toothed leaf trees or shrubs of the birch family. Now, I don't think this is our definition. But yeah, no, the book does a good job balancing, because, you know, Lex Luthor was a mad scientist for most of Superman's history, and then it wasn't really until the 1980s that he became like the evil business guy. It's almost as if there was a trend happening in America at that time that would have meant that a businessman would be seen as more evil than a scientist. Anyway, but I thought they balanced him as sort of a fledgling politician, businessman, and scientist well, and definitely an evil genius, and definitely like a full-on sociopath, psychopath. I never know exactly which of those two terms I'm supposed to be using. And I think, you know, they never tell us exactly how old he is, but I think we're getting a similar to Smallville or the other characters in this book. We're getting a slightly younger version of him than we would see in the comics, but not that much younger. And I definitely can kind of get like the Gene Hackman Lex vibe, but as a younger man. Like I think the character's written with sort of that voice a little bit, that whole like I'm the greatest criminal mind of a generation. That pomposity, if I can use that word correctly.
Yeah, I took him as being like very late 20s or early 30s at the start of the book, and then by the end it's like mid to late 30s for his kind of role in it all. I found it really interesting trying to juxtapose the straight up like he's corrupt in government and all that kind of thing with just the number of schemes he has in this whole thing. Like he has so many schemes going on. Like, and every moment he like takes a note being like, oh, that would be a good scheme for later. Like he's got cat houses. He's got to
the point that it's kind of wacky. Like
yeah. He's got a hospital for like retired crooks. He is constantly embezzling money. He's moving stuff around all over the place. And at the same time, he has the legitimate business side, which, we don't really get to like his ultimate plan, but it's kind of implied that he was going to like wipe out all the world leaders by way of his robots.
Or at least blackmail them.
Yeah.
I mean, he's very into blackmail, this version of Lex.
Everyone gets a robot.
It's the next essential thing.
And I only ever hear Lex as Clancy Brown. So the entire time I was listening to this, I was slowly chuckling to myself.
I don't know that this version of Lex's voice has dropped to that level, but when they talked about him getting some sun and like getting a little bit bronzed skin, it made me think of the Bruce Timm Clancy Brown, because I feel like the way like the Bruce Timm Paul Dini Superman era was. It was unclear to me if like they were trying to code Lex as a black guy. Like his Clancy Brown's voice is so sonorous and deep, and the way they colored the character, the skin tone was dark enough that I was like, I could totally see this guy. I could see this as a not white person. It was, as a kid, I think I was a little confused about like who's Lex supposed to be exactly?
Yeah, that debate is not uncommon. Like my sister growing up always thought that he was supposed to be black in that, and I was like, well, but the comic character's white, so I had just assumed. And I know that I see it pop up every now and then that like that specific iteration was supposed to be black in terms of like what fans thought. I have no idea what the actual intent was. Well, I should say I have some idea of what the intent was because he's supposed to look like a Bond villain, but I don't know if like the actual like final ideas had started to sort of like go there. I'm not sure. Either way, I think that this is a really fun way of having this character who has so much going on and he's responsible for all the bad things in this. Like, it's him dealing with a crooked pawn shop that he controls that sets off Willie on his path. It's the various times where he's fucked around with stories that Lois like eventually like started to investigate that like we find out about that. And ultimately, of course, the climax of this is Superman fighting a robot that he didn't design himself, but he is responsible for the existence of, and the fact that it was combat ready, even if it was going to be a version that was supposed to serve martinis. I think they do a good job of like trying to make a case for like how Lex Luthor could make sense, because he's so evil sometimes that, and like, especially like mad scientist Lex, you're like, well, why would he do that? And like, usually the argument is that like, well, nowadays he would actually just start a business and become rich. And in this case, he did that. Like he became a government official.
There's a scene where he's a little introspective about that, where he's like, I could just have money and be rich and be done with it. And he's like, no, I want something more than that. I want like there's like a power hungriness in him that he himself can't really identify. And I think that's really interesting. Like, I like the idea of a Lex Luthor who's like, I know I got to be doing crimes. I don't totally know what my motivation is here, but like, I can't just make money and be content. I gotta crime it up somehow.
Yeah. But like halfway through the book, he basically has realized that like he has all the political power he will ever need. He has all the wealth he'll ever need. He has everything he could possibly want. And it kind of gets nihilistic, which is why we get the sort of robot plot. And then at the end, it's the first time he's happy. Like in the whole book, he's like, I have met my match. I can chat. Like, I'm challenged by a person. This is exciting.
To the point where he's willing to help Clark out.
And
get him a suit that won't get ripped to tatters.
That was weird because like the suit just pops up at the Daily Planet, and he's like, "What do I do with
I mean, to me, Lex is the ultimate, he's the ultimate bored kid who should be in the gifted class, right? Like he's sitting in class bored out of his mind because he already knows this stuff. And like everyone around him is thinking slowly enough that it's annoying. And so like, he just decides, screw y'all, I'm gonna do crimes.
Yeah, so just a fun take on the character. And interesting that they went with Lex Luthor, considering that, if this is supposed to be Action Comics #1 Superman, roughly, like, Lex Luthor is far away from actually being introduced at that point.
Well, but by the end of the book, when, the book ends where Action Comics #1 is supposed to start, like, Lex is out of the picture because he, got his schemes got found out enough that he is on the lam, so to speak, and will probably return at some point when he's figured out a new scheme for that. But Lex is just so iconic. You can't do Ultra Human Knight in this novel and have anyone care.
Who's that person they're talking about?
Here's a sidebar explaining, like, well, before Lex Luthor existed,
they have. Clark at one point fights a giant gorilla. Like we got a taste.
Yeah. I had notes to talk about Paulie, Sticky, and Carl, which are Lex's 3 henchmen. Sticky, I have very little thoughts about. Aside from it, I distinctly remembered the scene of like Luthor coming to see him as he was like dying and ultimately killing him, and then using Steel as first a madam, and then to name the Lexbots, and like that whole like thread there.
You pronounce it Steel?
Seal.
Okay, like Cecilia, but just cut.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
I was just.
Yeah, it's Cecilia or Seal Stokowski is how it's written in the book.
Gotcha.
And ultimately, her character matters more in my recollection of this story because, like, well, first of all, her death is the thing that like triggers like the actual end fight because they like go deal with her. But she just was like a more interesting character as someone who like thought the world of Lex Luthor and then realized that he murdered her husband, and like that kind of sucked.
Right, and Lex Luthor is in my, other than Otis in the movie, Lex is not really a guy in my mind who has a lot of henchmen. He's clearly got like employees and people who work for him. And to me, Mrs. O'Shea was kind of the mercy role.
Mm-hmm.
And I dug that. I thought that was a cool riff on the character. There's a couple of times where like Tom DeHaven doesn't just do the character that we know from the comics or from the mythology. He just does a version of it. Like Willie is, to me, very clearly a Jimmy Olsen type, but isn't.
Yeah, I saw a note that he was going to be, like Jimmy Olsen was going to be his alias, and that part got vetoed.
Really?
It's that anti-Scandinavian sentiment that was running rampant in the United States at the time. They couldn't tolerate an Olsen in the story, even though they had Ben Yeager.
Right.
Big Kraut. It's okay. I'm German. I can say that. I can call him that. It's okay when I say it.
Paulie is just kind of a douchebag. Like he makes a point of being hating his dad, hating his friends, hating his partner, being cool with killing like the person he technically works with. Just an awful human being who stole a robot and that robot went nuts. Which you have to wonder, like, if Paulie hadn't fucked up by like taking it, if things would have gotten worse with Luthor. Like,
but then that almost, that's a whole can of worms, because like Luthor's plan is to give these robots for free to important politicians, business people, and Hollywood folks, and then the robots are really surveillance agents. It'd be like purposely installing a speaker in your home that had a microphone built into it that was listening to you all the time. But and then using that to like play music or like set a timer for when you're baking bread. And I have one, so I'm being completely hypocritical right now. But that's basically the plot that he's putting out there as a supervillain. Notice that one of the more popular brands of this particular, we'll call him a smart speaker for lack of a better term, is a bald billionaire with somewhat nefarious goings-ons.
Yeah, with videos of him controlling robot arms.
Launching himself into space while his workers unionize. So that's his villainous scheme, and he talked about like giving them to Hitler and giving them to Hirohito and giving them to Mussolini and Franco and all the in addition to giving them to the British royal family and to the president and to the president's wife and to all these Hollywood people. And like you have to wonder, with the way this Luthor is portrayed on issues of race, if when word started getting out about something like the Holocaust happening, or if he picked up on it before it even started happening because he had a robot in Luther's or in Hitler's chamber. Like, does the robot kill Hitler?
I was wondering about that. I was like, wait, like, it would be probably pretty bad if he like had the robot do something to FDR, but it's also going to be with Stalin and Hitler.
Yeah.
I wonder.
So anyway, but the plan gets foiled by Polly's stupidity, and then Clark has to fight a big robot, which is kind of the only really like big action set piece we get for the entire book. Like there's a few instances of Clark doing, heroic things in a very quick, blink and you'll miss it fashion, but this is like the only real fight in the book.
Yeah, a lot of the super events are like after the fact, like when Clark first saves Willie, like by like tearing apart that like garage that those gangsters were hiding out in. Like those, we're always told about it afterwards, like right from the start with the criminal that comes into the movie theater. Like it's from the perspective of Clark has already stopped the situation, not the way he wanted to, but like he got shot and the bullet bounced off him. This is the only time we're in the moment, and this is also the only time where we're really in the moment with Superman as he deals with pain, because he gets his ass whooped, and for a minute there isn't even sure if he can continue the fight.
Jmike, it sounded like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was like, is he hurt? Because like I hear he's talking. The narrator is saying this stuff. He's like his knees are shaking, like his hands are hurting, all this stuff. I'm like, did he get hurt? I'm like, oh, he got his ass kicked, and now and now he's kind of like stumbling around trying to figure out what to do next. And I was like, oh, okay, gotcha. Now I understand what's going on.
To me, this version of that kind of fight worked so much better than what we get in Man of Steel.
Yes.
Where Clark's definitely explored the limits of his powers more at that point, and like even if he's fighting another Kryptonian, like should know better than to keep that fight in the city. Whereas this Clark is genuinely enough of a rube that I can see him needing a minute to figure out how to tackle an opponent that can actually knock him around a little bit. It was kind of like you guys talked about this in the science episode of like Clark would reach a point in his life where he would probably stop flinching because he wouldn't be anticipating pain happening to him whenever a punch was being thrown or a bullet was being fired. And this is a Clark who hasn't figured that out yet. He's not quite there yet. And he's a kid who's used to being the toughest guy around. And so when he gets hit and actually flies backwards and finds himself lodged in a building, I think he's so shocked that he just needs a minute to pull himself together to actually get back in the fight. And it's kind of, I thought it was a well-handled series of moments for the character.
Yeah, I rather enjoyed the description of that fight. It does make me think, oh, I'd like to see more of this, but it was good that we saved it for this one point in the book.
I really like when fights are about the characters, like when it's not just, like I love a martial arts movie as much as the next guy, but like to me, the fight should also be telling a story about what these characters stand for, what they're about, what their values are. And this fight did a really good job of that.
Yeah, like a boxing movie, like a Rocky. Like it's way more interesting, everything that leads to the fight than the actual fight part itself. But the fight part is, the culmination of all of that. This
is definitely a version of the character that I could see putting on the gloves under the red lamp with Muhammad Ali and going for a couple of rounds.
That's true. Yeah.
And losing, because this Clark has not trained to fight nearly as well as Ali did. So
so just kind of going through other characters. I don't have a lot to say about Dick Sandglass and Ben Yeager, who are the cops that are trying to investigate Luthor. It's interesting that how it comes around. And again, like all these characters sort of like get tied up in each other. Like Ben Yeager is dating Lois while at the same time, like Dick is like investigating stuff and like goes to Soda Waters and gives her a file, and like how they all kind of like come back together. But that's sort of more just like the convenience of the novel than anything else. I do like that Ben Yeager becomes an actor at the end, like completely flipping roles with Clark in that regard. Like he gets married to Skinny.
I think the only character we haven't really talked about that warrants at least a brief mention is Willie. We mentioned that he's the Jimmy Olsen type, but we didn't really get into.
I almost called him Pete from Smallville.
Yeah, a little bit of that too.
Well, it's the same role there, because like Pete was Jimmy Olsen, but for Smallville, like for like Superboy stuff, and like in that regard, he's there, but he's also older. He's more of a troublemaker. But yeah, as soon as it's like, oh, he's a photographer and they dye his hair red, I'm like, oh, he's the Jimmy Olsen. But he, I guess I could see this character getting into enough trouble consistently where he could be turned into a giant turtle at some point. But it's.
I kind of like by the end of the book, the last chapter of the book is all the characters that we've kind of are still in New York City by the time the book is ending. Go and see the play Our Town. Mm-hmm. And have either of you seen Our Town or read it or been?
I have, yeah.
I was in it in high school. I was the choir director who's perpetually drunk, which is nothing cooler than a high schooler pretending to be drunk on stage for a bunch of people. Like no clue. I don't know how to direct the choir either. So I'd forgotten about that scene at the very end, and I thought it was an astonishingly beautiful moment for all the characters, because Our Town as a play, for folks who haven't seen it, is about this small town in New Hampshire, and it's a very like, I don't know, it's meta for a play from the 1930s, where it's like there's a stage master who's like describing the things that are happening, like breaking the fourth wall, talking right to the audience. And it sort of ends with a character dying, and the character gets the opportunity to relive any of the days of her life that she misses experiencing. And she tries it, and it's too painful. And so she can't do it. So she basically just returns to nothingness, because the nothingness is preferable to the pain of remembering what it was like to be alive. And it's this beautiful play about like the preciousness of life and like what little time we have together. And it gives Clark a panic attack, because he's like, I don't know if I'm ever going to experience death. And like, that's freaking me out, because like he had just experienced the loss of his mother and then the loss of his father. And like, he knows that all these people around him that he's growing to love, that this human race that he's like dedicating his life to protecting, he might outlive. And I think he's already feeling that sense of melancholy, because like he and Willie have kind of drifted apart by that point. Like, it's been a couple of years. He's gotten Willie out of the legal trouble that he needed Clark's help with. And now Willie's like got his own life and is doing his own thing. And they just don't see each other as often as they used to. And like, we've all had friendships like that, but to be sitting on the other side of that friendship sort of fading away a little bit, while also thinking about you being potentially immortal. Like, I thought that was beautifully sad.
Yeah.
And just really hit home for me as I finished up this reread of the book.
Yeah, it's very much a look at the same point that like Invincible makes, where it's like, what will you have in 500 years kind of moment there. And it's obviously he doesn't know that he's going to live that long, or if he would live that long, but it's certainly a terrifying concept for Clark to have to explore.
Right. And Mark, and when Mark has to answer that question, he's answering it to somebody who would still be there if they just put their differences aside. And so, Mark Grayson has an answer in that moment. He says, "You, Dad, I'd still have you." And that's what breaks Omni-Man. And Clark doesn't have that other person in his life to say that to.
Yeah.
And so he is alone, and it's really, really sad.
Yeah. I really like the relationship between Clark and Willie. Like, like you said, it feels very much like those kind of like young friendships, or like young adult friendships, where like, yeah, you're riding the rails together. You're like splitting like a shitty apartment together. Like,
it's your college buddy. It's the guy you stay up late with, getting drunk, smoking weed, and being like, so like the universe, man, like what if we're just like pages in a comic book? Whoa, he's that friend. And you sometimes maintain those friendships into adulthood, but like you also sometimes grow up enough that relationship isn't what it once was, and it can be, I don't know, it can be sad to realize that, but it's also, that's part of growing up, I think.
It's kind of like Siegel and Schuster, like directly, like they were better friends. They did fanzine stuff. They created Superman. And then like as like careers and whatnot, they eventually like split apart as co-collaborators.
I could have seen them sticking together longer if they hadn't been so completely screwed over by National Comics financially. Like if they had just paid them money, maybe they wouldn't have been able to just keep working on the stuff that they were doing.
Yeah. No, if they had been paid a fair amount. I mean, because it was a big cash cow for them when it occurred, but it just wasn't. They weren't getting what they were owed for just the commercial juggernaut that was Superman.
I mean, fortunately, that's the only time that's happened in the history of comics, and since then, it's been smooth sailing.
Yeah, no, there's never been a factor that has affected anyone.
That was sarcasm for the listeners at home. That's happened a lot in comics.
It's an editor's note from Stan the Man. Like, I fucked over that artist.
And I think the only nod we got to Siegel and Schuster was when they introduced Perry White, and they say that he was poached from a paper in Cleveland, which is where they were from.
Yeah, I caught that. And that was also fun to like indicate that Perry White was the new part there, and that George Taylor had been there already and was the established figure, just to sort of set up that like that shift from like the Action Comics #1 status quo into
right. And I was bummed that we didn't get a Daily Star versus Daily Planet Easter egg. I was looking for that, but they didn't include that in, because the Daily Planet wasn't introduced until Action Comics 23. I think it was the Daily Star up until then.
Right. It was the radio show first that had the Daily Planet, and then it was back.
That radio. We owe the radio show for so much. I don't think even the biggest comic book nerds know that without the radio show, we don't have Kryptonite. We don't have the Daily Planet.
You don't have Perry White. You don't have the Daily Planet. You don't have Jimmy Olsen.
You don't have the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, I feel like they can keep that one.
Well, we don't have a superhero actively fighting the Ku Klux Klan.
There we go. That is a better.
The active opposition for these groups that are embedded in our society and that people are sometimes afraid to tackle. That is one of the promises of a character like Superman, like that you can no one's untouchable to him. Lex Luthor would be untouchable to most people, either because you'd be afraid that he'd have you killed, or you'd be afraid that you would be the one that ends up in jail. Ben Yeager tries to take him on. Dick Sandglass tries to take him on, and they go down. Like, Dick dies.
They build basically an unimpeachable case enough that Lex Luthor has to take him out, and he does, and it's not that hard for Lex, and he kind of just does it and moves on.
Right.
And it's also by the end of the book, like, Superman is a publicly known figure. He's been invited to the White House. He's afraid to go because he's afraid FDR is going to tell him to join the army, and he doesn't want to say no because that would be rude. But it's also just but you could also kill the president very, very easily in that moment. Like, his ability to do basically whatever he wants is, even though it's a much underpowered version of the character relative to what we would eventually get, because it is more of this golden age type guy who can still get knocked over and isn't accidentally sneezing and taking out moons of planets when he does so. So I thought they balanced the amount of power he has with the way that he wields it and his role, or the way he sees his role in society as the guy who can glance out the window and prevent a guy from hitting his wife with heat vision. And I thought that was, but also isn't he wants to do more, doesn't just want that to be his whole life. I thought they balanced all that really nicely.
Yeah. Let's talk about Superman's powers for a moment here. Because that scene with the heat vision I loved. And I forgot that the heat vision was a thing he could do in this book after my first read. Because I was just sort of thinking oh yeah, it's roughly the 38 power level. And coming back and being oh, right. No, he has heat vision. And they have a really interesting way of describing how his eyes feel after he uses it. Yeah. They describe that it feels gummy afterwards, which I think is such a cool kind of concept there.
It's a little, honestly, I gotta say, it's a little icky to me. I'm a little creeped out. Ugh, gross. No, thank you. No, thank you.
And that's why you wouldn't explore it. If you're man, that felt weird, I don't want to do that again.
I think the most important thing for a storytelling perspective, especially because this is prose, is not a visual medium, is the heat vision is invisible to everyone, including Clark. It's just, he just looks at something and then stares at it intensely, and then it catches fire. Right. And so that helps him, a lot of this book is sort of the Clark doing things faster or more covertly than people can even notice that he's doing them. So if you had the heat vision be a thing that was obvious and blasting out of his eyes, I think it would actually hurt the story more than doing it this other way where things just get hot. And he's clearly got some form of X-ray vision. It doesn't seem to be as crazy impressive, but he's super tough, but he can get hurt. He does bleed at one point. He's super fast. He can jump and probably fly, but they never kind of fully establish.
They indicate that he can change his direction.
Yeah.
And that's him being I definitely can fly. I'm just not there yet.
And he's still kind of figuring that one out. And then he's got the X-ray vision, the heat vision, no super breath, but he does have super hearing because he can hone in on Lois Lane's heartbeat, and he can tell if people are lying. And he actually seems to know anatomy well enough to know how to use that power really well, which I thought was interesting because this is not written as the smartest or most educated. I think it's they talk about this character being, I've seen criticism of this book that Clark is dumb. And it's I think he's as smart as a person who went to school in rural Kansas in the 1930s would be. He's not an idiot, but he hasn't had a lot of life experience. They say Paul Kent went to school through 8th grade. They don't say if Clark went fully through high school or not, but finish, if you were a farmer, an 8th grade education back then was probably enough to get you by. He's clearly literate and enjoys writing, but is constantly making errors in his writing, which I always enjoy. I always enjoy that Clark and Lois aren't that good at writing,
but in different ways. Lois can't spell for shit, and that's just a canon thing now. But Clark always gets the year wrong or a specific date wrong,
or so and so doesn't actually. You said they worked for this place and they haven't worked there for a couple of years now. They work somewhere else now, so he's just not up on the town gossip. But I think I don't think they introduce any other powers, do they?
No, I don't think so.
Super breath is the only major one that he has now that isn't referenced at all in this, freeze breath.
Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was a moment where they reference him breathing on a thing
They
hard.
do. There's one moment where they mention like he sighs or he exhales or something, and they mention something about leaves rustling like really far away. But
that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Huh.
I remember catching that when I was rereading. I mean, I literally just finished rereading the book, so it is very fresh.
Yeah, it's fun, like, getting the chance in prose to describe some of these powers. Like, the scene where he looks out the window and stops the man from hitting his wife by, like, scorching his hand. It's like, that's the first time where I ever really thought about, like, just how awful that would be to be that person who got heat vision turned on him. Like, having third-degree burns all of a sudden just, like, manifest on your skin. I don't know. When it's, like, beams, like, drawn on the page, it's easier to think it's, like, a concussive blast, like a Cyclops blast, than, like, just how terrible, just, like, not even like a sunburn, but like
radiation burns on your hands.
Yeah, just like blisters and whatnot, like emerging.
Funnily enough, third degree burns do not hurt because a third degree burn is bad enough that your nerve cells, have. But usually, if you've got third degree burns, you've got second degree burns around the third degree burn, so you still have a peripheral painful second degree burn. But anyway. Fun fact about burning your skin.
Not a thing that I want to have happen regardless.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, but I feel really glad to look at this book again. If anyone is listening, and I mean, we haven't gone like super specific into the actual story. We mentioned that Clark goes to Hollywood, and also there are robots, but like, it's still just a good book to read. I would be anyone who's listening who is like, what the hell are they talking about? I'm always confused why you're listening to the show, but but I would say check it out. Like, it's the book has a great narrative style to it. The audiobook, I also think, works really well. It takes a minute to get used to the voice, but once he's like, once characters really start talking to each other, and it's not just like the more descriptive parts of like setting the stage in the first chapter, like it really like kicks into high gear, and I think it's a really good read. So Ryan, thank you for bringing this.
I have a question for both of you.
Sure.
I came with a question. All right, so you can have one of three options. You can only pick one.
Oh, gosh.
Option one, they do an animated movie version of this book in the Max Fleischer style. Option two, comic book adaptation of this book. You can pick whatever writer or artist you want to do the comic book adaptation. Option three, a prose sequel.
I would take this in the Max Fleischer style. I feel like it fits more.
That's a real strong contender. I am wondering about a prose sequel. Yeah, you did mention you wanted to talk about a prose sequel. I'm going to lean towards the Fleischer style, but I am like, maybe I am curious what you could do as the sequel.
Yeah.
I think this book was good enough and fleshed out the world enough that I would trust Tom DeHaven if he wanted to do the next big adventure that Clark has in fully enmeshed in New York City, fully being Superman. Maybe introducing a couple more villains, maybe getting Clark a little closer to figuring out some of the Kryptonian stuff. I think that would be a really compelling read. But I think seeing this animated in the Fleischer style would just it'd be so cool.
It'd be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're kind of like primed to like the Fleischer idea for this one. For one thing, Fleischer Superman is super in right now with just like pop culture representations of like old school Superman stuff. Superman and Lois uses it. Superman Smashes the Klan used it. Like, we're starting to see a lot of the black behind the S kind of design and whatnot. The cover for the trade paper, or not for the trade paperback, pardon me, just the paperback, is a panel from the actual Fleischer cartoons. So that also kind of primes it. And the descriptions of the costume are the Fleischer costume. Like, they talk about it. It's like, it's black until Lex Luthor gives him one where it's yellow behind the S. So I definitely think like Fleischer is where my head goes to first. I would be really curious to hear Tom DeHaven's pitch first.
Okay, so you're taking an editorial role. You're saying.
Like, if I was like greenlighting one, because like a comic version, I can't imagine really conveying the things I like about this book. Like the fact is, it's the format of being a prose story that I really like for it. And like the most I could see is like maybe like accompanied by illustrations by like Alex Ross and like a Norman Rockwell style to kind of go along with it. But like, I still wouldn't even want it to be a comic book. I would want it just to be a book that happens to have some like illustrations accompanying it. And even then, I probably would still prefer just to keep it purely as prose. Animated would be cool though.
I think it would be really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Who do you get to do the voices? I know we can't do all of them, but like who do you cast as at least Clark and Lois and Lex?
Gosh. I know I want for Lex. Saving it.
Well, you still just want Clancy Brown?
Yes. He's my
Michael Rosenbaum actually wouldn't be a bad version of this Lex
Rosenbaum
Luthor.
actually would not be a bad version.
Yeah.
And he's a great voice actor, too.
He's a good voice actor.
I'm going to be cheap, and I'm going to say our friend Yuri Lowenthal for Superman on this one, because it's got that young Clark kind of vibe, and I think that would work really well.
Lois?
I want it to be Dana Delaney so bad, but it is a younger Lois, and like she's 66 now, so like it's going to sound different. The problem is that as a man in my mid 30s, like trying to keep track of like the actresses in Hollywood who are the right age,
right,
or even voice actresses, with that who sound like this like 20 to 25-year-old character. Like I don't know them that well off the top of my head. I just am bad at keeping track of all these because I'm like, well, a younger Lois, like a Kristen Bell, that's not a younger Lois at this point.
Yeah, it would almost be worse. It'd be worse if you like knew a ton of names and were like going through like, well,
yeah.
I think maybe like a Chloe Grace Moretz might be good.
Oh yeah, okay.
I feel like she's got like she could do sort of the tough, takes no guffness. She's 25. I just looked that up. I did not know that off the top of my head. I'm gonna go. I think she would be good.
Yeah, she would be really good.
All right, I think we nailed it.
Or like a Selena Gomez wouldn't be bad for that.
There's no reason you couldn't. I mean, there's no reason you couldn't. Yeah, mix it up. And I'm of a persuasion that like none of these characters has to be white. They're all white because of the history of publishing being pretty racist and bland. So like if you want to mix it up and even fully make if you want to cast someone like Selena Gomez and then make her like Lois with a Latin last name, like I'd be totally into that too. It wouldn't bother me at all.
Well, and like as we see with a lot of characters in this world, a lot of people have changed their names to get around the amount of prejudice that exists in this world. So it perfectly would be in keeping for her dad to have changed their name to not incur any kind of like public scrutiny like that. So
that's
I don't know.
Good point too.
Selena Gomez went like only because like I was obsessed with Only Murders in the Building. Is why I immediately went there. And also she was also in Neighbors or Neighbors 2 with Chloe Grace Moretz. So I don't know. Any of those would be fine. You
could also do a Kiernan Shipka, I think would be good. The daughter from Mad Men in the Sabrina Netflix series.
Okay. Willie is my question.
Willie. That is a good question. He's got to be a little older than Clark, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking Adam Brody.
I mean, are we still just...
Or is that too old now?
That's a good question. Paul Rudd. The guy's ageless. Does not age.
Well, anyway, like I think it's fun to speculate on this, but the other side of it is that it's still just a Superman property, so it's just us like speculating on who would be great for Superman characters, with like a couple of exceptions. Like Willie's a little older than like what a Jimmy would be. Like Willie's older than either Clark or Lois in this, so it should be someone with a few more years on them. But
Sam Daly, Tim Daly's son, do the nod.
Oh, for Clark or for?
Well, you guys already cast Clark, so I wasn't going to step on your toes there. But like Sam Daly as Willie.
As Willie? Okay.
I think Sam Daly is kind of a redhead, but not fully a redhead. And I don't know why. Let's keep it in the family. Let's give the Daily some love.
Why not? Let's go with it.
I love Tim Daly.
It.
Tim Daly. I think Tim Daly is probably my favorite Superman voice actor, but that's a different episode.
Yeah, he's great. I rewatched, or no, pardon me, I didn't rewatch. I watched for the first time Brainiac Attacks last night because I realized I'd never seen it, and half the cast is from the animated series and the other half is not, and it is so awkward because the designs all look like the animated series, but then like it's Powers Booth as Lex Luthor, and his personality is the Gene Hackman Lex Luthor, but he's designed to look like the animated series Lex Luthor.
Well, and Powers Booth's voice is closer to a Clancy Brown than it is a Gene Hackman.
Not the way he does it.
Really? He puts on a voice? I'm sure I've seen this. I just don't remember.
It's weird. And Lance Henriksen is Brainiac in it, but he's designed to look like the Brainiac from the animated series. It's not good. I
have a thing I was gonna recommend to your listeners, but I just decided that it's a future episode of the show, and I'm not gonna spoil it right now. So gotcha. I'll tell you guys about it off air.
All right.
You guys do ratings? Do we rate things?
Ratings. We typically don't. Right. Usually we'll say if we liked it or not. I like this book a lot. I think that my enthusiasm when you suggested it and the fact that we're doing it indicates that, like, yeah, I'm pretty pumped about this whole thing. I think people should check it out. It's good. Jmike, this was your first time reading it. Like, what was your overall experience?
Read it or listen to it. No, but it was a fun book. It took a little while for me to get into it because it started off very slowly. But like you said, like once he actually gets into like the acting and doing the different parts, the story picks up. Then you're kind of like, oh, this is kind of good. I kind of like this. This is fun. But it did get kind of sad at the end. I thought it was going to end on a little bit higher note, but Clark almost has like a nervous breakdown at the end. But it was still a good book, though.
Yeah,
it was fun.
Yeah, I had forgotten how melancholic it gets at the end. That surprised me a little bit, and it had a pretty emotional. I had a pretty emotional response to even just reading it, which was interesting. But in general, I really like this book. I think it touches on aspects of the character that you just don't see anywhere else in ways that are different enough to be interesting, but not inauthentic to who Clark and Superman and the rest of these characters actually are, which is very important to me because I'm, like Superman is someone Superman and Clark are like characters that I take very seriously and care a lot about. And like, if I felt like a story about them was false in any way, it wouldn't work. And I feel like my brain would reject it. And this doesn't do that. It toes the line ever so carefully. And comes, I think, for anyone who loves any of the Superman-based Elseworlds stories, and for anyone who loves, this era of American fiction, the Of Mice of Men, the East of Eden, the Great Gatsby, I guess this is a post-Great Gatsby, but like that era of fiction in that time period of America, I think we'll get a kick out of this book.
Yeah, I think it's really fun. It's the only time where I've ever really related to Jonathan Kent.
Yeah.
Like him talking about his relationship with Martha and like they're trying to have kids. I'm like, well, at that point in my life now, I should be kind of thinking about those kind of things. And like, actually, it was a very relatable experience there, which I normally don't get with that. Normally, Clark or other people, not the dad who's like the moral figure, not the father knows best.
Daniel Warren Johnson did a story in one of the Superman Red and Blue issues recently that was like kind of a Jonathan Kent story. And as a new father, it broke me. I was actually crying because it's basically Jonathan is really worried about being a good dad to Clark. And so he goes and like talks to a reverend or a priest or some sort of religious figure. And the guy just says like, look, being a dad's tough. You just got to tell him that you love him and that he's proud, that you're proud of him and that he's special. And so like the rest of the comic is just these little vignettes of Clark growing up and Jonathan telling him like, I love you, I'm proud of you, you're special. I'm gonna get choked up just talking about it. And then it's like ends with Clark flying around the city saving people, and like as he's saving every person, he has this thought in his mind of like, I love you. And then the next person he saves, like, I'm proud of you. And the next person he saves, like, you're special. And it's like, oh, it's so simple, but it's so effectively good. So this isn't
Daniel Warren Johnson's gonna break you no matter what. If you're
he sure did, man. I already like Beta Ray Bill, but come on, like that, he just crushed it with that series. But yeah, that short little Superman story, I think in part because I'm a new father, was just gave me a Jonathan Kent appreciation that I hadn't had before, but this book definitely does it as well. So
yeah, so it's a good book, y'all. Listeners, if you have not read it yet, and again, still confused, but you should check it out. It's a great read. It reads very quick when you actually like have it in front of you, and like Jmike, that's not crazy long for an audiobook, frankly.
Oh no.
The paperback was like 400 and change, so it's a good yarn.
Yeah, because you recommended the book, I was like, okay, I'll look it up on Amazon and see if I can get the book. And I was like, oh, it's on Audible. I'll just get that. And I saw it. I was like, 16 hours? Huh. It's not that bad.
No, it's not that bad compared to some of the true tomes that you can find on there. Anyway, so Ryan, thank you again for coming on. Give your plugs. Like, where can people find you? What have you got going on?
My name is Ryan. I'm on the internet with my website, ryanhaupt.com. That's HAUP as in Paul, T as in Tom, as my mom likes to say. I'm on Twitter as just @Haupt. I joined Twitter early enough that I snagged that one. For those of you in the know with men's fashion, there is a German menswear brand called Haupt, and I occasionally get tagged with people being like, heading out to the club, wearing my Haupt. I'm like, good, go for it. I appreciate
rock on. I love you. Yeah, I'm proud of you.
You're special. I don't own any of these shirts because I'd have to like literally get them shipped from Germany, but I'm kind of like, it's the only shirt I would in my life I wouldn't need to get monogrammed, so I should just do it. But anyway, as that's a total aside. Twitter at Haupt, Instagram at Ryan Haupt, and I do the iFanboy podcast. So if you're into comic books and not listening to the iFanboy Pick of the Week podcast, as well as the iFanboy Animation Brain Trust, where we do the animated movies that are released in the comic book space, I do all those shows with those fine folks over there. And I do my own podcast called Science Order, which you can find at scienceorder.com or wherever you get your podcast, presumably even this one. And that is a show where myself, as a scientist, and other scientists talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science. So you might get an episode that's all about the cool technology of the James Webb Space Telescope. You might get an episode that's all about how, like, you can track, if you try to track the ecology of Bigfoot, it turns out you're just looking at black bears. So, you know, we kind of go across the whole spectrum of science. It's basically listening in on a lab meeting or a happy hour where a couple of scientists, friends of yours, are getting a beer and talking about what we're working on, what we're excited about. So that's all my stuff. And yeah, just thank you so much for having me, guys. This was a ton of fun.
Yeah. Well, I've always enjoyed whenever you've been on the iFanboy Pick of the Week podcast or any of the other stuff. Like, it's just, you stand strong for the millennials on there.
I often tell them that I see myself as like the plucky kid brother, even though like I'm a gray haired dad, but I'm just like, no, I'm the plucky kid brother to these Gen X, these cynical Gen Xers, and I will fight for the Power Rangers over G.I. Joe every single day.
Oh, man. Oh,
well, and I also owe you a debt of gratitude because you recommended at one point the History of English podcast, and I started listening to that, and that put me in the mood to talk about Old English, which has resulted in, on my other show, me talking about Beowulf so many times because I was just like primed to talk about Beowulf stuff because I was listening to the History of the Old English.
The History of Old English, it's definitely a homework podcast, but you learn so much if you commit to just like, I'm going to sit down and listen to an episode, because you'll literally learn like the derivations of, you know, half a dozen, if not more, words an episode.
Mm-hmm. It's like, well, this is that guttural French being spoken when the Normans came over versus the French that came from the court when other people came and intermarried and whatnot. Like,
to me, we my wife and I watched a little bit of that show Vikings. That was on History Channel for a while, and I don't know, I think it's on Netflix now. But like the main character in season 1 is this actual historical figure named Ragnar Lothbrok, and I'm just like, that's such a cool name, Ragnar Lothbrok. And then in History of English, they talk about Ragnar Lothbrok because he was a real person, because part of his history was invading England as a Viking, not England, invading the British Isles as a Viking. And you find out like Brock is the Old Norse word that eventually gets us breeches. So and Loth in Old Norse is hairy. So he's literally Ragnar Hairy Britches. And I'm like, well, that's not intimidating. Like, britches made out of hair? Like, what's happening? This is so it kind of sort of gives you this lens of viewing the world, especially the English speaking world, that just kind of breaks a lot of things about your perception of how things are when you get X-ray vision, but for words, I guess.
Yeah, it's always fun. Like, I've always been terrible at language, even though I was a classical studies major in college, but like, I've always loved understanding the nature of language, and this was just a really fun one. So thank you. I am, like I said, in your debt for recommending that one.
Oh,
and like, it's kind of funny where it's like, that was like such a revolutionary thing.
And Jmike, what have I done for you?
So, I read this book, so it's lots of fun.
There you go. All right. 2 for 2. Love it.
Nice. But yeah, so everyone should check out Science Sort of. Everyone should check out the iFanboy podcast. Everyone should find at Haupt. And then they should head on over. Well, they can head to Twitter. They can find me at Case Aiken. Jmike, where can they find you?
At Jmike101 on Twitter.
You can find the podcast at Men of Steel Pod. And then you can head on over to certainpov.com, where you can find more episodes of this show and tons of other great productions that are going on. Such as, I'm going to give a shout out to Panelology. It's our own like pick of the week podcast, or not so much a pick of the week, but a rundown of the weekly comics that have come out. So it's a great show. Alex is awesome and has been on a ton of time. A great introspective look at the comics that come out and like what really stood out about them, and like why the art format in general just kind of matters, and like why keeping up with these like monthly books is important still. So check that out. And next time we're going to be talking about the JSA The Golden Age Elseworld series. So keeping that Golden Age kind of vibe. Right, I didn't mention this episode is going to be dropping right after we did an episode on the radio show. So it's like we're kind of doing a Golden Age kind of thing. check that out. Check out our other shows. And until next time, stay super, man.
Men of Steel is a certain POV production. Our hosts are Jmike Folsom and Case Aiken. The show is edited by Matt Storm. Our logo is by Chris Batista. Episode art is by Case Aiken. And our theme is by Geoff Moonen.
Hello there. My name is Leo, and I'm here to tell you all about my Dune podcast, Gom Jabbar, the perfect podcast for new fans of Dune and longtime fans of Dune alike. My co-host Abu and I dive deep in both spoiler-free and spoiler-heavy episodes covering Frank Herbert's original novels, the film adaptations, the board games, the comics, the upcoming video games, the HBO TV series, anything we can get our hands on. We even have a companion book club series to make your first or your 15th read-through even better. So, if you recently saw Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Dune, or if you read Dune back when it came out in 1965, this is the podcast for you. You can find Gom Jabbar on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, pretty much anywhere you find your podcasts, and we hope you join us on the Golden Path.
So, I have a question. Have you ever wanted to get into comics, but you just didn't know where to start? Well, welcome to Comics Quest. I'm JD Martin, and every week I sit down with a guest to talk a comic that I think anybody can pick up and start their comics reading journey. We take a look at psychedelic sci-fi, fantastical action, heart-wrenching love stories, and of course, superheroes. So check us out at certainpov.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.